For hundreds of years, the Iron of Power was sitting in a precarious position. A dwarven civilization was being destroyed by goblin invasions. They could not hold back their onslaughts, losing fortress after fortress. These dwarves valued their culture and desperately wanted to save it. And in the year 365, a small group of 7 dwarves decided to move as far away from the wars as possible. Fleeing as refugees, they arrived at a grand smoldering mountain, nestled in the middle of a frozen tundra. It is in this place that they would build their new home, far away from the reach of the goblins, until they had the strength to fight back, to save their original home. However, the leader of these dwarves had a dark secret. The expedition leader of this small group of 7 dwarves was a religious zealot, associated with a religion called the Dead Communion, focused on death, deformity, and disease. And she had a plan for religious superiority, a plan to crush those that were not believers, a plan to make her god rise above all, to eventually rule as both the religious leader of the Dead Communion and queen of the Iron of Power. Alright, cut the character here for a second. I just gotta be honest with you, I was just really tired after spending a super long period of time, struggling against one of the most moronically stupidly difficult biomes I've ever encountered in this video game, and now since that video that I made about that fortress, Godly Tombs, has had over 100,000 views, I figured it's time for me to do something a little bit more casual. So we settled somewhere easy on a volcano with metal, and I just decided to take an approach that's a little bit different to the last major video, where instead of building something that is difficult to play mechanically, I decided to take something easier and build a narrative using the prompts that the game provides for me. This is a story of cults, of war, of death, and over-engineered defense systems so over the top that it would make Armok blush. Oh, and of course, don't forget the elephants. We must defend them with our lives after all. And besides, who doesn't like an army of cave dragons? This is the fortress of Gortusk. As the dwarves say, strike the earth. Or as I generally say, consider it struck. The volcano that we settled on is called the Blaze of Twine. It has a heavy aquifer in the bottom left-hand corner of the map, and comes with silver and lead. Although once we embarked, we noticed that there's actually quite a lot of iron on the map. The location is a wilderness biome, meaning there will be some animals that could be a threat. However, the animals aren't going to get agitated by our presence and do not desire to see us strewn about into tiny little itty-bitty pieces. If this was an untamed wilds biome, that would be a different story. The embark process is pretty simple here. We selected 2 baby elephants because that was what we could afford. Being able to start off a fortress with elephants is a rare treat, and not something that all dwarven factions have access to. Although oddly enough, we weren't able to trade for any for the remainder of the fortress. This was only something we could do early on, so I'm happy we did. The fortress went through a few different name iterations, but we settled on Gortusk. Honestly, while building the fortress, we didn't have a theme at this point, just some vague outlines of what we wanted to do. The local government naming was a little bit silly. Initially, we started off with some very over-the-top ideas, and eventually settled on the Trampled Machine, sticking with that refugee theme. Without further ado, the embark begins. A dwarven outpost. You have arrived after a journey from the mountain homes into the forbidding wilderness beyond. A new chapter of dwarven history begins here, at this place, Gortusk. Strike the earth. I wasted no time with just simply beginning to dig some tunnels and hallways. I didn't really know what layout I wanted, so I was simply improvising. The expedition leader was Stinthad, Oil Finds, who would eventually become known as the Elephant Tender, and our future religious leader. But that's a story for later in the video. We began digging areas that would be used as meeting zones, such as guilds and temples and taverns, and engraving the walls. An early priority for me in this fortress was finding a place for my elephants to safely graze, so we had to find a cavern lair. Because this volcano is located in the middle of tundra, there's nothing that grows here, so the elephants will quickly starve to death if I do not find them a source of food. For that, I'm going to dig down to the nearest cavern lair and create a pasture for them to eat. But when we did hit the cave layers, it's completely flooded. Well, time to roll up our sleeves and do some dwarven engineering. I'm going to dam this pool, and then pump out the extra water. The way I'm going to do this is by digging circular constructions around the edges of where the water is located, followed by adding supports and then connecting mechanisms to, whoa, hey look, we have our first migrants. New dwarves arriving, and among them is Budgie. Well, isn't that fascinating? We'll get back to the damming project in a moment, but I just want to talk about this for a second. Budgie is a dwarf from a fortress called Dragonspike of the Strong Balls. Don't ask, chat named it. Dragonspike is the first fortress I built in this world, which I founded back in the year 301, after playing some adventurers. The fortress of Gortusk has started in the year 365, so that is an exciting development for me personally, getting to see a returning dwarf. That being said, he is haggard, meaning he's quite upset, so hopefully we can recover his moods and he doesn't become a problem. Anyways, back to the Big Rock Sploosh project. The way this works is we're going to completely remove all of the connective tissue from the rocks surrounding these pillars and then place supports on the tops of them. These supports can then be connected to a lever using mechanisms. Once everything is connected, we just have to make sure that there is nothing supporting the boulders anymore. The support structures will hold the entirety of these blocks to the ceiling above them. And then once everything is connected, all we have to do is pull a lever and then wait for a dwarf to come and give it a tug. And just like that, we have splashdown and a safely sectioned off portion of cavern, and all that's left to be done is remove the water. So we'll hook up a couple of pumps and pump the water off the map. To complete this, I am using fortifications. These are normally used to shoot arrows or crossbow bolts through, but I'm using them to pump water off the edge of the map. This works as long as it is right on the edge of the map. And then I'm actually spinning one of these around just so that I can dump some water back in to create more mud on the ground. The reason I'm doing this is because it will cause more moss to grow, increasing the space of grazing for my elephants. More moss equal more food equal more better equal elephant less likely to starve to death. And everything was fine until the Crocodile Nation attacked. Apparently, a cave crocodile thought it would be a good idea to come crawling out and bite the dwarf who was pumping the water back in. The dwarf is a little bit worse for wear, so that means it's time for a super sanitary hallway hospital. If they're lucky, we'll put a bed in it. And for the crocodile, well, we can always just beat it to death. And by that I mean punch it to death. Shoutouts to the militia captain. They did have an axe, but I guess they just decided fists were more effective. And for the injured dwarves, well, they'll be patched up in no time. Seems the militia captain got a couple nicks as well. A couple seasons have passed and we've started to get what actually looks like a fortress up and running. I've got this nice old trench here, which I'm going to fill up with lava, and we're going to use this to begin lava forging, because as we've been digging around, we found quite a bit of iron and a lot of lead and silver. With a quick pull of a lever, the lava begins to fill up the trenches, and there's nothing quite as satisfying as watching lava just slowly snake around your fortress. And I'm sure, just like myself, there are many of you out there who also appreciate some good ASCII. Look at it. Glorious. And soon enough, we'll have some magma forges, and this fortress can get rolling properly. Speaking of rolling, some more migrants are rolling in. It's good to see the population climb up to where it's supposed to be. In fact, there's enough of them that they're going to elect a mayor soon, and they've also started demanding guild halls. Much to my dismay, because I've already made a weaponsmith's guild, and that's the only one I want them paying attention to, but no matter, I'll make this craftsdwarf's guild. Since Budgie seems to be sorting out his mood problems, we've appointed him to the position of manager. Due to his long and storied history in the world, he has quite a bit of experience in the trade already, so he seemed like a good fit. I'm going to remove him from other tasks so that he can take care of his managerial duties as his first and foremost priority. I've started constructing some bedrooms as well. Currently, these are public for just about anybody, but that won't be the case for very long. The fortress is starting to take shape, and I honestly think that the look of it is quite nice. Sort of like a bent crossbow, if you will. The elephants also have been making happy noises, so I presume that there is enough moss growing for them to stay full. It takes them 10 years to age up to full-grown size, and these ones are 5 and 6. So it's going to take a little bit. In the center of the screen, these tables are the Weaponsmiths Guild. The dwarves congregate here so that they can teach one another the skills of weaponsmithing. I'm not going to permit them to have a tavern until we have at least one weapon artifact. I mentioned that the dwarves are going to elect a mayor, so I might as well build an office in a super safe location. And the first artifact appears in the fortress. Shameful. It's a Daysite earring. How dare they call this craftsdwarf ship of the highest quality? It doesn't even have a pointy object on it. It's not even menacing with spikes. We can do better. The The elephant tender, our expedition leader, has been hard at work teaching all of the dwarves the skills of weaponsmithing, and with any luck, we'll get some proper artifacts soon. Work on the mayor's office is coming along quite nicely. It's even got in-floor heating. Frankly, I think any dwarf worth their salt would be very excited to have an office like this. And construction begins on the proper temple for the Dead Communion. It's going to have multiple floors. It may not be the most popular religion, but it is for sure the most important. And thankfully, we have a good supply of silver and iron around, so we've constructed silver warhammers and iron armor and begun training a small military. And finally, a proper civilian artifact, an iron battle axe. This is a good sign for the future. But still, no taverns will be permitted until morale improves. Keep at it, dwarves. I expect more artifacts. Word must have gotten around quite quickly as the population continues to rise. Over 90 dwarves have arrived here now, and our new mayor stands up to greet them. This mayor also migrated here from Dragonspike, and their name is Ermaluk. They also arrived with their spouse, Kokoroko. Can you tell I named these dwarves after viewers from Twitch chat? Because I don't think anyone will ever notice. Once again, Ermaluk has quite a bit of experience in the field, but it is worth noting that they are demanding a nickel weapon rack, which isn't something I have access to making. I could import it, but they don't worship the gods of the Dead Communion, so we'll have to just simply ignore that one for now. The goblins must also not approve of her demands for a nickel weapon rack, as they have arrived seeking a parley. They wish to kill us all if we don't give them our valuable battle axe. And to that, I say no. The goblins had arrived right as we'd begun construction on our proper front gate. It was to be a 2Z level tall, massive structure designed to impose a feeling of fear in anyone who dares to enter. Fortunately, due to their parley requests, we had a little bit of time to spare, so I made sure all of the dwarves were properly equipped with weapons, and the goblins strike back with their spears. In a one-on-one fight, a dwarf is at a severe advantage against a goblin, for dwarves are just naturally stronger than their green and gray counterparts. But that doesn't mean it's going to be a clean battle. The dwarves were undertrained, and many of them were just recruits. The dwarves formed a line against their enemy, and right away we could see dwarves taking damage and crying out in pain. The militia commander was striking at the goblin swordsman, but the shot was deftly parried by a copper scimitar. After being knocked over, the militia commander was able to jump away and then bash the goblin axeman in the left upper arm with a silver warhammer, bruising the muscle through the copper mail shirt. Neezer, the militia captain, said, "Can it all end so quickly? Begone, fear." Overexerted and bleeding, the goblins may have met their match, and rapidly it became obvious that the dwarves were going to be victorious over the pathetic attempt at a goblin invasion. Militia commander Neezer, followed by Napalm, his second in command, would turn those goblins over faster than Armok could say, "Lamau." And Neezer would scream, "This is truly horrifying." The hammer dwarves charged at their enemy, screaming in fear. But it couldn't have been anything compared to what the goblins were feeling, watching their friends fall. As silence rested over the battlefield, a cry was let out. "Bring out your dead!" by Napalm, who had received some incredibly painful injuries in the fighting. Moments later, Napalm had let out her final breath. "Rest in peace, dwarf. We thank you for your service." Napalm's final words were, "Death. I'm very uneasy." The rest of the dwarves were rushed off to that very sanitary hallway hospital. I also had to add in a traction bench, which is used to set bones, and the military wasted no time in getting back into training. And I also decided that it was probably time to give the dwarves a bit of a tavern, because, well, they were a little bit upset, having seen their friends die in front of them. And nothing helps depression like alcohol, after all. In fact, the dwarves liked the tavern so much they immediately started dancing. The glittery style, to be specific, was their first dance of choice. A style of dance originating in the Iron of Power, where the dancers perform in a double circle, moving faster and faster to the music's Okab rhythm. But the celebrations wouldn't last long, as a wereskink would arrive. This horrific creature was stalking across the top of the trading outpost, just south of the fortress's entrance. Almost immediately, the creature jumped on an unsuspecting dwarf and began to rip and kick the dwarf to pieces. The weaponsmith, who was under attack, was Raikalu, 30 years old and creator of Luslem Shiget, an artifact battle axe. Unfortunately, it was made of lead, so we just put it behind this pretty metal bar as a display piece. But as a creator of an artifact, this dwarf will be greatly missed. They'd already been bitten many times, meaning their body was infected with the were-skink curse. And shortly thereafter, the skink showed mercy. Satisfied upon improving its fighting, it killed Raikalu. After doing that, it moved on to Rydern, one of the fortress's fishery workers who had been fishing down in the caverns by the elephants, where it would do the same thing, attacking the dwarf. The dwarf jumped away. The fishery worker tried to fight back, but it was no use. The fishery worker was mashed against the wall and crushed under the weight of the creature. Only moments after that, the full moon would fade, and the creature would move back to its true form. Soksu, Shipspite, the peasant. Legendary thresher and cheesemaker, but no skills of value aside from that. The cowardly creature would flee from my military, with no interest in resolving the conflict it started. And so it's time for me to make a couple more tombs. It's unfortunate, but at the very least, wereskinks didn't infect the fortress, so I call that a win regardless. During the wereskink attack, another artifact had started, but it was just a lead cabinet. A heavy cabinet's better than no cabinet, but it's still just a heavy cabinet. And the dwarves, or particularly the elephant tender, the expedition leader, had decided it was time for us to take the fight to the goblins, for they had taken too many of our own, and the recent losses from the wereskink had left the dwarves hungry for war. Ranger Rick, the Holy Whip, and leader of a different religion, the Doctrine of Fortresses, wasn't in agreement with this path. Moving about the fortress, he would discuss with his various friends about how the expedition leader of Gortusk was a disgrace. War was not a solution, he would say. We must stand our ground and defend ourselves, but we mustn't destroy the goblins. However, it was starting to seem like the dwarves disagreed with this, for another weapon artifact had been created. This one was a silver warhammer, titled Fubeg Gbar Einen Gutted, and it was claimed as a family heirloom, but that's alright. I'm sure it can still be donated to our glorious military. And the military had just returned from one of their first attacks, and it was going pretty well. The dwarves were stealing tomes and books from the goblins' libraries. We would of course use them as a source of entertainment and knowledge for our dwarves and religious leaders. But the goblins didn't seem to take too kindly to this, quickly sending more sieges. The goblins seemed to have spies in our midst, because they sent their sieges precisely at the time that my military had left. With only 79 dwarves in the fortress, and none of my melee dwarves that were properly trained, it was going to be tough to fight this one back. My dwarves were caught so off guard that we actually had to trap them in the entry walkway. Construction was still underway, and 4 dwarves were lost. It's a shame what had to happen to them, but the security of the fortress takes priority. The dwarves could hear them screaming from the main halls. It was a horrific sight, and one that required vengeance. Several of their child snatchers, the kidnapping goblins, made it into the fortress itself, but fortunately, they were unarmed, and the dwarves were able to turn them into streaks of red mist. The Marks dwarves lined up to do battle with the goblins, but soon decided it was probably best for them to ambush them from behind, as charging in head-on was likely what they were expecting. And Ranger Rick led the charge from the far side of the goblin encampment. The dwarves closed the drawbridge to trap them inside of the front hallway. With only one of them outside, picking off the stragglers was easy. Dwarves ran in with a volley of bolts, turning the goblin into a literal pincushion, whacking him over the head with their shields and crossbows for good measure. But it was an honest example as to why running in headfirst would have been a bad idea, as many of the dwarves sustained injuries fighting simply one goblin. The Marks dwarves are intended as a ranged defensive measure, not a front-on offensive measure. Fortunately, as the fighting had just begun, Neezer, the militia captain, had come back from their most recent raid against the goblin fortress. Sprinting across the open fields, the dwarves would have backup. And with time to spare, the dwarven military met with the goblins, charging in and fighting them back. But Neezer and their squad held off just enough so that Ranger Rick and the Marks dwarves sustained heavy injuries, but swooped in at the last moment to finish off the goblin threat. Shortly after the fighting ended, they delivered their reports to the expedition leader and the mayor of the fortress, explaining how the assault on the goblin fortress went. And in their report was great news. They had acquired not 1, but 7 cave dragons. Cave dragons are sort of like giant cats. They can be trained for hunting, trained for war, and are very affectionate pets. But they cannot fly, and cave dragons cannot breathe fire. However, they're still a formidable force, and the dwarves now had them in their hands. It also helps that dragon eggs are very large and can create some awesome omelets. And as the medics ran in to carry out the injured Marks dwarves, the Hammer dwarves were praised as heroes. And as the aspiring glory of the military powerhouse of Gortusk, began to have an effect on the citizens of the fortress, so did the artifacts. The dwarves would create Lemul Kubur, a weapon worthy of gods, which would surely be a gift to the militia commander Neezer. This was a lead warhammer. All craftsdwarfship is of the highest quality. It is encircled with bands of fungi wood. This object menaces with spikes of lead and magnetite. On the item is an image of macadamia trees in dog leather. On the item is an image of a bayberry tree in white opal. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why is this cool? Well, in Dwarf Fortress, the damage of blunt weapons isn't measured by traditional numbers. It's measured by the weapon's weight. Lead is one of the heaviest materials in the game. There's only a few that are heavier, making this possibly one of the strongest materials to be made into a warhammer, and extremely effective at removing something's teeth. Calling all dentists, we have a new thwack stick for you. Don't worry about how, squishy lead actually is in real life. This is Dwarven engineering after all, and I assure you, it will not bend. Although it will cave many goblin skulls in, quite effectively. And with their new weapons in hand, the militia would head back out to the goblin fortresses to steal more dragons and begin raiding the goblin pits. Glory to Gortusk. May the strongest warriors stand tall. We will defend the motherland and return us to unification and peace. Six years have passed since the founding of Gortusk, and Stinthad, the Elephant Tender, religious leader of the Holy Disciples of Yugath and the Dead Communion, enacted some new laws, enforced by their newly elected Mayor, Ermalok. She decreed that all dwarves who worshipped the holy figure to be dubbed the Disciples of Yugath. Those who were wed to the disciples, or directly related to, were servants of Yugath, and everybody else was an unholy outsider. The outsiders were left without bedrooms, and provided with menial labor tasks. The disciples were allowed time to relax, enjoy the tavern, and kept away from the more distressing tasks given to the dwarves. The disciples and servants were also provided with bedrooms, while the outsiders were left to scrounge for themselves in the dormitories. Surprisingly, even though these laws were strict and considered harsh by many, things moved on and continued roughly as normal. There was, of course, some deceit amongst the dwarves, but they were all united under one goal: the revival of the Iron of Power. The leader of one of the two opposing religions, Ranger Rick, created a nice cabinet. While it was a cabinet of high value and the craftsdwarfship was of the highest quality, it wasn't a weapon, so it was considered an act of protest by the nobles of Gortusk. And the dwarves would put a much higher value on artifacts such as Kadol's Tishak Gar, a lead short sword, a beautiful ceremonial piece. It will make a wonderful donation to the Church of the Dead Communion. The dwarves were consistently attacking and besieging the goblins, putting them in their place, showing them the strength of the Iron of Power, making it clear that Gortusk was here to stay, as a monolith to be feared, and a military powerhouse. It was during these holy wars that the dwarf Corvius, disciple of Yugath, created Debak Bedan, a lead door, and offered it to the trampled machine. This door would be placed at the entrance of the volcano, and be left as a reminder, a grim reminder, of what could happen to a dwarf who betrayed the holy leaders. But the goblins did not take kindly to the sieges, and their attacks increased in strength. Iron bolts rained in volleys, blotting out the thin shafts of light coming into the caves. In the murky, dimly lit entrance of Gortusk. Alright, so for full transparency here, I completely underestimated the strength of my dwarves in this fight. I absolutely thought that they could take them in a head-to-head battle. I had not one, but two well-equipped Hammer Dwarf squads, as well as a full Marks Dwarf squad with decent quality ammunition. The initial battle seemed to go well, but it quickly turned for the worse, so I had to regroup and decide on what I wanted to do with this fortress going forward. What I eventually settled on is that I would build a large upper floor area for the cult, and dedicate the lower floors to crafting and the rest of the population. The cult would be able to have more or less free reign of the fortress, with the exception of the regions full of bodies, with the cult mostly occupying the upper floors. But construction is slow, so that's going to take a while to actually come to fruition. This loss also made it very clear that in order for me to keep this fortress afloat while building this terrifying cult, I needed a better system of defense. Briefly, earlier in the video, I showed a scene when they were installing spikes. Those are going to be attached to minecarts, which will cause them to go up and down. We'll cover that later. But I had to find something that was efficient, effective, and appropriately elaborate. Something that would make Rube Goldberg proud. We'd get there eventually, but there would be plenty of failed prototypes in the process. This was one of those failed prototypes. The original idea was to get the minecarts going so fast that it would skip across the top of the lava, causing lava mist to appear. While I was able to make it work briefly, I wasn't able to get the lava mist to raise up a Z level. Lava mist is essentially a tile that fills up with lava, but because it doesn't cancel entity pathing, the enemy will walk directly through it, unknowingly setting themselves on fire and spontaneously combusting. Magma mist is caused when things skip across the top of lava. So I was trying to get these iron minecarts going fast enough that they would skip across the top of the lava instead of ducking back down into it. The way that people generally make a system like this work is by using impulse ramps, but that is a bug that I generally don't like to exploit into our fortress. So instead, I moved on to more extravagant options, shall we say. But for now, enough of the explainers. Let's dive back into the story. So, what exactly do you think happens when you have a volcano that's very close to a dwarven fortress? And there's a way that things can just walk from the volcano into the fortress. Well, clearly the answer to that is surprise fire imp. This little twit decided to wander into my fortress out of the volcano. And while that would be totally fine under normal circumstances, it also decided to turn one of my dwarves into a walking barbecue. And I'll have you know that that's totally not okay. And fortunately, cave dragons are immune to fire of all kinds. They can also see through smoke, and promptly tore him to shreds. And they referred to themselves as Tire Nourish. Well, I would like them to know that now that they are no longer with us, the look that they must have on their face makes them look tired and malnourished. Anyways, what was I doing? Right, yeah, cults and things. So we continued invading the goblins and stealing their stuff, mostly livestock. But something worth noting kept happening that I thought was very interesting. We kept seeing this on the screens where we were invading the goblins. These are dwarves from a fortress called Spirit Home. Spirit Home is another fortress that I ran previously in the same world. Spirit Home was a very casual chill fort. Of course, all of the VODs are available on my VOD channel, as per usual, link in the description. But these dwarves were attacking the same goblins as we are right now, and a bunch of my dwarves got captured, and I managed to release them with my squads, which is kind of incredible, and I don't think I've ever actually managed to do that before. At least not as part of a different faction. I've managed to save my own dwarves before, and I've also saved them in adventure mode, but I've never once managed to get outsiders appear and request to join. However, these outsiders maybe had had a rough life in that past fortress, perhaps, and one of them immediately started committing crimes. So obviously we knocked his face in, beat him to a pulp, and threw him into the very sanitary hospital, and then chained him up in prison. Although he tantrumed again and managed to kill 2 people on the way, so we're gonna have to deal with him at some point. So I began scheming together a method of dropping things of unimportance into volcanoes. Fortunately, we've had somebody else who's been tantruming for a while, so I can test out my prototype for unlifing those that disobey, and I would like to say that it works flawlessly. And I also began reconstructing that failed experiment into something a little bit more efficient. I was making a loop for a minecart track and installing powered rollers to make the minecarts go in a circle with a switch on each track. These switches would be connected to the spikes that are up top, and every 10 ticks, when the switch is pushed, it either pushes the spikes up or pulls them back down, making anything standing on top of them a bit of a pincushion. A rather effective method of making Goblin go splat. Now you might be thinking to yourself, oh hey look, a bunch of goblins. Excellent opportunity to test out the spike trap. Well, it's not hooked up yet, so it's actually a terrible opportunity to test out the spike trap. In fact, I would actually say it's the absolute opposite. Not only that, but they rushed in quick enough that I didn't even have time to react properly. So I fought them head on with my military, and this fight went about as well as you'd expect. Cue the dramatic music. Most dwarves remember the Great Siege of 375. Many dwarves perished that day. Some loyal, some not. It was a horrific bloodbath, but thankfully the consistency and accuracy of the Marks dwarves and the assistance from the cave dragons saved the fortress. It was a horrible sight to see. The dwarves were forced to lock the gates, with soldiers still in the thick of the fighting. Brave warriors felt abandoned and left behind, and many talented soldiers fell. Gortusk would have to train a new military. They still had some commanders remaining, specifically Sideburns, who is a legend in his own right. But as the goblins were retreating, a final dragon got to make its mark on the enemy army. Sackluster was the name that she had taken, ripping through the back lines of the goblins before falling. A final blow to the fleeing cowardly goblins, afraid to finish their job. For Gortusk, this was war. It was time to accelerate the construction on all of the defensive machines. Nothing like this could ever happen again. Under the rule of the Elephant Tender, they had been instructed to build a fortress worthy of the king, and in order for that to happen, they needed to be a metropolis. The population must go up, not down, and these constant deaths were destroying that opportunity. So without any hesitation, the dwarves got to work cleaning up the piles of bodies and building tombs for the restless dead. There was great amounts of unrest in the fortress, and Stinthad had her work cut out for her, having to speak with many dwarves who were complaining, saddened by the sudden loss. But things carried on as normal. Trading continued annually with the humans and dwarves. The cave adaptation was starting to get to some of them, but it didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And the cleanup took weeks, months even. But just like any good plan, the pieces were coming together on the next machine. And aside from a few accidental lava spills, everything was running smoothly. That is until some random thief got into the fortress. Nothing a dwarf with a hammer, named Sideburns, couldn't handle. Woo! Sideburns was rapidly becoming the strongest militia commander in the entire fortress. A religious loyalist and bearer of a great beard, wielding the lead hammer that was once held by Commander Neezer, who died some years ago in a goblin siege. And as the spike traps were connected to the rumbling minecart tracks, fights broke out, spewing vomit over the entire fortress. A dwarf who goes by the name of V, one of the outsiders, had murdered several of the recent migrants, as well as two of the very skilled Marks dwarves. This was a crime that we could not ignore. So the great religious leader decided it was time to separate the dwarves further. Those who were not religious loyalists would have their own tavern, close to the surface and far away from the safety of the inner sanctuary. And while V sat in prison, wasting away through their sentence, awaiting proper punishment, the dwarves would trade with the mountain home, giving them gifts, hoping to see a king someday. As the fortress grew, so did the population, thus increasing the membership of the Dead Communion. This called for a new religious figure, a new sacred starvation, so the dwarves appointed Hair as the proper heir, because she had big hair. It was funny at the time, okay? The invasions against the goblins were going well, and the dwarves had acquired several goblin pits. When dwarves needed to be expelled if they weren't a member of the religion, then they could simply send them to the pits, and they would continue to operate and grow the faction far away from us, because they smelled bad. Or, at least, that's what Stinthad said. Perhaps she should listen to her own advice once in a while. Up until this point, there hasn't even been any soap in this fortress. None of these dwarves have ever had a bath. Perhaps she got punched in the nose real hard at some point as a child. I suppose we'll never know. Besides, she had more important things to attend to, such as V's 42 days left in prison. Preparations needed to be made. And the sanctuaries for the Dead Communion still needed work. And because Stinthad was recently made into a countess instead of just a measly baron, she also required a tomb. So the orders for construction were given. Time was passing quickly, and so was V's sentence. But the dwarves had work to do, and plenty of tasks to complete. The dwarf Sideburns, militia commander, rapidly becoming one of the strongest dwarves in the fortress, took the opportunity to name his shield, calling it Lolokmat, which translates roughly to the Granite Bend. I would assume that this refers to his warhammer, the unbreakable lead monolith, a weapon feared by many. It was around this time that V was released from prison, and after getting his first drink, he proceeded to then walk into the restricted areas of the fortress, starting fistfights and causing injury. Well, that won't do. Off to the volcano with you. Goodbye, V. You were a hell of a dwarf, and had good aim with a crossbow, but crimes like these cannot be tolerated. And Stinthad felt the need to send a clear message to the dwarves. A gravestone was created to memorialize V's life and prevent any disturbing haunts. It also served the purpose of dissuading dwarves who might consider attempting a revolution against the Dead Communion. But yeah, anyway, things were kind of busy around the fortress and I had a lot of work to do, so I was busy constructing all of the temples and needed necessities for the upper levels of the fortress. I didn't even have enough bedrooms at this point for all of the dwarves, so I was kind of amazed at how happy the dwarves were, all things considered. Something amusing that I noticed is one of our recent migrants liked to eat live birds. Specifically, she was a fan of eating cave swallows, which I was so repulsed by at the time I decided to name that respective dwarf with the nickname Bird. She was also a member of our military, so I was sure that she would come up later. We continued trading with the mountain home, and they still refused to bring me elephants to trade. But mine were growing up, so at least by the end of the fort, I would have a couple of adult elephants. Ermaluk, the mayor, was in heavy disagreement with their demands not being satisfied. They kept requesting materials I didn't have, and also the way the fortress was deciding to deal with criminals. Shortly thereafter, Ranger Rick died after a very long hunger strike. These hunger strikes began shortly after he was engaged in combat, back when he was the leader of the Marksdorf squad. We also decided we should move the hospital, but I'll get to that later. The dwarves thought it best to put Ranger Rick's coffin into the Dead Communion. After all, they did worship the dead, and he was an important member of the fortress for a time. But hunger strikes are not the way out, and the dwarves wanted everybody to be aware of that. Ermaluk, once again, disagreed with this choice and continued to argue and make demands. So the dwarves thought they would take matters into their own hands and manufactured a small incident, including an elephant statue for good measure. Hope it's warm down there, Ermaluk. We look forward to our new mayor. Strangely enough, the dwarves decided to elect another religious leader. This one was the leader of the Lined Coven, going by the name Salvador and the rank of First Shore. This also wouldn't do, so the accident had to be remanufactured. During that mess, a couple goblins thought they'd try to sneak in. Fortunately, they were quickly ripped to shreds by the Marks dwarves and a couple of the pet dragons. All the dwarves needed was to link some mechanisms to a lever and wait for the mayor to go to bed. The second he walked into his bedroom, they pulled the lever and the statues fell, sending him down directly to hell. This time, however, there was a witness, which was a little strange. It was a dwarf who wanted to speak with him, either about some religious nonsense or the general state of affairs in the fortress. Caught in the dust, the dwarf was thrown into the air, landing safely next to the pool of lava. After waking up from being briefly knocked unconscious, she would run around and act mildly confused, but decide that it was a mere accident. Strange how it happened twice in the exact same place. But clearly some higher power decided this wasn't to be. The game crashed. And, well, as annoying as things like this are, what does that mean? Well, instant replay. Setting up the statues, shredding some goblins, waiting for nap time, and the incoming splat time. If anything, I would say it was better, as there wasn't even a witness this time, and I quickly instructed the dwarves to make repairs in the mayor's office. And fortunately for everybody, this time, Stinthad decided to stand as acting mayor. So rather than risk allowing some other religious zealot to run for office, she simply took it herself, remaining as the complete and total ruler of the fortress of Gortusk for the time. Thus, the invasions continued, striking down many goblins and anybody else who sided with them. Sideburns was becoming a legend in his own right. Stinthad's tomb was nearing completion, and a bunch more fire imps got into the fortress. This time, they got a number of casualties. The first round killed 2 dwarves. This one killed 3. Thanks again to the dragons for sorting the problem out as fast as it started. I guess we'll have to memorialize those, as we'll never find the bodies. And a giant took the opportunity to arrive. A giant problem, one might say. Shortly after its unannounced arrival, the uninvited guest decided to book it directly towards the fortress, encountering one of my recent recruits. As much as some dwarves would love to reenact the Elden Ring experience, if I can solo her, it doesn't always end that well. The giant also found one of my Marks dwarves who didn't have much gear on at the time, and turned him into a pancake. But once the military arrived proper, Sideburns and Squad quickly disassembled the giant and put it in its place, in the dirt. Shortly before the fight with the disagreeable giant, Sideburns had taken a title. This title was the Bright Buck, which is honestly the most badass title I've seen since Kill Bill. So I guess he's here to... Bird was also beginning to make a name for herself after that fight, and was growing in combat skill. The dwarven scholars of Gortusk were also making progress, after studying all of the books that they had rightfully reacquired. Oxtrot was one of those, studying alongside of dwarves such as Hare, and she quite enjoyed her new job. But of course we needed more books, and the goblins needed to be put firmly in their place. And something else I should mention is we were in the midst of building a new machine, to cause goblins to lose their foreheads. And you might be thinking, look, goblins, great opportunity to test it. And frankly, I would have loved to, but this siege was so small and the construction was still in a construction site phase, so we just had to rip them to shreds, the old-fashioned way. But constructions were coming along nicely, and we would soon have cart grinders. But at the moment, the dwarves were distracted by new, excited volunteers wanting to join the fortress. Many disciples and heretics alike. Everyone was welcome, to a point. Unless you decided to demand a temple, we could never allow such a thing to exist, aside from the grand cathedrals for the Dead Communion. And of course, the disciples agreed. But no matter how precise a dwarf is, accidents happen, and a forgetful dwarf pulled a lever when they shouldn't, causing a minecart to ricochet through, causing several dwarves to lose their lives. A shame, but the fortress must go on. After creating artifacts in their honor, it was time to test the machine. It still needed some polish, but after a few small refinements, the design was almost ready to test in action. But repeated distractions kept arising. This time it was a very tall creature with the head of a bull. Fortunately, it showed up near the Heretics' tavern. And they did a surprisingly good job just beating it to death. Well done, dwarves. Small threats are no match for even a heretic. A few days passed and the minecart tests were proving successful. The machine was ready. All it needed now was some goblins to test out in the blender. But this, and the raising and lowering spikes, wouldn't be enough for sieges, even with some lava at the bottom. So as the dwarves began to construct luxury apartments for the members of the Dead Communion, they also began to enact plans for the final piece of the fortress defense, as well as digging downwards. They'd been told that there were artifacts in the depths, and those were likely needed to become a mountain home. So the dwarves started creating cave-ins to push down through the deeper layers of the thick stone, and discovered some sort of supposed ancient horror. Well, nothing that Sideburns and the military can't deal with. In fact, Sideburns didn't even have time to get there. The military had already killed it. Stinthad was happy with the state of her military, confident that Gortusk would stand tall for all eternity. The few casualties who died to the brute were, of course, memorialized as heroes, and the dwarves began preparing for another manufactured cave-in. But not before they discovered another cave layer, which is always exciting, but it wasn't something the dwarves were going to allow to slow their progress, and the dwarves began discovering treasures of the gods, as well as more fiends from down below. Thankfully, most of them were crushed in the cave-ins, alongside of the occasional heretic that decided to be in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Dwarves were also beginning to pass away in the prison due to neglect. This was of course intentional, and Stinthad did her best to make sure the other dwarves were unaware of this fact. The demons below who didn't die in the cave-ins were executed with precision arrows. It was fast, quick, and efficient. I'm interrupting this broadcast for a very important message. I obtained new glasses this weekend, but normal human beings generally don't care about what I wear on my face. So instead, I'm going to say this. I don't have sponsors for this video, because I think you should be watching YouTube in a mostly ad-free experience. So instead, I sponsor myself by commissioning artwork and making it into a mug. This mug is available now and says Gortusk on it, making it pretty cool. This mug will be available on my merch store until the last day of September. Anyways, back to the video. No matter what was discovered deep below the fortress, the dwarves were under strict orders to continue digging. Stinthad wouldn't have it any other way. Population of the fortress had gone up despite the errors and horrors that they had discovered, enough to make them into a metropolis. And on the 3rd of Fellsight, in the year 380, the ruler arrived with his full entourage. Gortusk was a thriving site and had become the capital, and with continued fortune and toil, their legends would be left in the annals of history for all time. But they hadn't yet become a true mountain home. For that, they needed 7 symbols, artifacts from the gods below, and a true throne created from gifts made by gods. And much to the disappointment and dismay of the dwarves, they were saddened to hear that the king was not a believer in Ugath, Larval Flems, the Lustful, nor was he a member of the Dead Communion, and the same went for the queen consort, his wife. But still the dwarves welcomed him with arms wide open, and the heathen king would wander into the fortress. But close behind them was another army of goblins. While their final weapon was not yet ready, the spikes and minecarts were. The dragons charged up front, and the minecarts filled with lava, traveling at incredibly high speeds, collided with goblins, knocking them into the lava and spraying debris everywhere, creating lava mists that engulfed the goblins in flame. But this was the most goblins the dwarves have ever seen, and it was a miracle that they were able to hold back the onslaught. But slowly and surely, Sideburns and his squads were able to push back the goblins that made it into the fortress, and the Marks, dwarfs, and the machines took out enough of the stragglers that the goblins retreated. Terrified and distressed, the dwarves began picking up the pieces and viscera left behind from the siege, and disposing of the refuse using their automated minecart. Stinthad had a plan, but things needed to fall in place first, and many tombs needed to be constructed near the new hospital, and so they continued digging, discovering more treasures and beasts below, crushing them in the process, and collecting the gifts. Some other goblin faction decided to attack them with a pathetically tiny force of nothing, and so Sideburns and his squads turned them into pulverized meat paste as the finishing touches were being put together on the Great Machine. So before I actually run this thing, I'm going to explain what it is. This is a minecart shotgun. The way a minecart shotgun works is you fill up a minecart with lava by dropping it into lava. I have a tutorial on how to do that. I'll link it here. And then you have to get the minecarts going really quickly once they're full of lava. When they do a full loop, I have them going down a ramp. When minecarts are going down a ramp, it angles the minecart downwards. And if the final minecart track is on a ramp that then collides with a flat floor, it causes the lava to be ejected out of the minecart and through fortifications or bars. I also have switches set up so that the minecarts then drop themselves through some metal grates and down into lava onto track rollers to then be refilled. The whole thing is powered with a heavy aquifer and water wheels. Building a setup like this is time consuming and took me about 12 hours due to distractions and other things getting in the way, but they are immensely effective. And you'll see it in action in a moment. Stinthad had instructed the architects to put together a machine by her design as screams were heard on the horizon. The Hydra Guz, Sterustonshen, Ifin, has come. A giant dragon-like monster with 7 biting heads. So I didn't even set this one up, but apparently right where it decided to appear on the map was right next to the Queen Consort. And after running around bugging some muskoxes for a bit, it just murked the Queen. Honestly, it saved me some work there. And with that, 1 queen down, 1 noble to go. A plan was in motion, and they'd just caught a Hydra in a cage trap. Things were definitely looking up for Gortusk. Except for the moods. Because those were, well, kind of bad. Shortly after the Queen passed, the faction general, Meng Oilyfold, arrived, who was the mother of the Queen. Must have been there to see if there was any foul play. No wrongdoing, miss, and welcome to the Fortress Gortusk. The king's quarters were shaping up nicely, suiting his demands to a T. We even placed his wife's coffin in his throne room, next to a memorial, as well as the Hydra, who did the deed. Stinthad says that it is a tribute to her life and the creature that killed her. It would suffer for all eternity in that cage. But not everybody was happy in Gortusk. Some visitors were starting to get uneasy, and began tantruming and attacking dwarves. Nothing the military couldn't clean up, however. And deep down below, more things required digging, and more monsters required crushing. But things weren't all bad. The luxury apartments were coming along nicely, very pretty in pink, and more goblins decided they didn't like living. So the dwarves began to line up along the tops of the walls and prepared the minecarts and pulled the levers. Little did the goblins know, but they were entering a tomb of their demise, the Eye of the Storm. The dwarves knew that many of them wouldn't survive, but it was for the glory of Gortusk that they would lie down on the ground and accept death if they had to. Goblins even managed to get up into the structure itself. Dodging the minecarts, they moved into the fortress. There was many near misses, and dwarven lives were almost lost at a catastrophic level. But considering the scale of the enemy invasion, the dwarves got out rather clean, and the machines would prove to be too much for the goblin hordes. And as they picked off the insurgent goblins, one by one, they prepared for a final assault. But it wouldn't be necessary. The machines had broken the goblin horde, and the cowardly goblins began to scatter. It doesn't matter if they number in the thousands. Fear is the most powerful weapon any dwarf could hope to wield. But not all enemies were outside of the fort. Reports were coming in to the captain of the guard that someone had been killed in the upper floors, near the Heretics Tavern. Some zombies had come in to chug alcohol for some reason. It's not like they could drink it or anything, so the militia had to go in and pick them off, because they were beginning to murder innocent dwarves. heretics, but still innocent. Sideburn's protege, Stackhood, led these assaults. Tavern cleanup, they called it. It was dark times. But after a couple of days, the last unwelcome guest was finally killed. And the following day, Gortusk would find themselves under siege once again. The bodies were still warm from the last attack, but the dwarves had something up their sleeve. Their artifact door had been placed in a specific location. While mining, the dwarves had made a discovery, something ancient and evil, and as they began preparing for the siege, they released it onto the surface. This is Ostets, Lyram, the Porcupine Devil, and its pet Eyeless Devil. The Porcupine Devil was a towering humanoid with the quills of a porcupine. Judging by the smell that it left down in the basement, it could breathe fire, and all the dwarves had to do was listen against the walls to know that their plan would work. Tsunamis of flame engulfed the goblin hordes. The Eyeless Devil went down quickly, but Lyram did not. The goblin forces could not see through the clouds of smoke. Goblin after goblin and beakdog after beakdog, it shredded its way through its enemy. Like a true doomslayer, rumor has it that something similar to this happened once before in this world. The scholars referred to it as the Blockade, a strange mystery. That creatures from the depths or dark places could become so strong. One by one, it eliminated every threat on the surface, for nothing was allowed to breathe in the path of Lyram. But the constant thumping and screams from above must have had a horrible effect on the remaining dwarves in the fortress, as tantrums were breaking out, and murders and crimes were being committed everywhere. Dwarves were going to prison and stacking up in the hospitals, and Lyram owned the surface. The dwarves began referring to it as their guest of honor, uninvited, but welcome. And the dwarves continued to create structures to go deeper, because they didn't really have anywhere else to go. Only a few weeks passed, and more goblins. This time they were there to meet their honored guest, who wasted no time in scampering across the surface. The goblins thought they were ready, but they were not, and the dwarves did their best to act busy and continue being normal, as the sounds and the screeches from the surface continued. There was work that needed to be done, and bodies that needed to be buried, and tombs that needed to be assigned. And as the dwarves continued to burrow ever deeper, they discovered an echo of forgotten divine retribution. This was what they needed. An angel clad in godlike weaponry. Weapons that they could forge and fire, and melt down into bars to make a true throne for a mountain home. Eagerly, the dwarves began chipping away at the remaining rock, surrounding the creature's lifeless corpse. Just as they chipped the final brick, they could hear the clang of goblin invasions. This time, there was an interesting development. A goblin named Utes Grandspider. This goblin was notable because they were lying down. Their lower spine had been bruised, and it turns out that they'd been here twice before. First in the summer of 381, and again in the spring of 382, sustaining a almost fatal spinal cord injury the second time they arrived. They'd also killed one of my dwarves in the past, named Toulon, Treaty Growths, one of my military, but this was likely the last time they would visit the fortress, as the honored guest was there to greet them. As before, the balls of fire and walls of flaming rock engulfed the goblins, but a lucky arrow flew directly through the stomach of the honored guest, spilling its putrid guts. Pale and bleeding, and stumbling, the creature let loose the remaining fire it had within it. Soon afterwards, the honored guest had perished. Grandspider had witnessed this entire thing and took a nickname, the Fool. Horrified, he wondered if he would live to see another day, let alone another siege. But it was time for the goblin invasion to begin properly, and they once again would witness the machines of dwarven creation. And as Stinthad gave the order, the cannons fired, knocking the goblins back, and the spikes began to rotate through their cycles, impaling those unlucky enough to be standing on their space. Utes, the Fool, moved through the smoke and fire, slowly, terrified. Moving up next to one of his friends, he screamed, "We must leave this place." And his friend responded, "I'll die before I do." Turns out, he would get his wish. as a goblin had been smacked by a glob of flying lava and was pushed directly into Utes' Grand Spider, and they were both engulfed in flame. On the other side of the gates, the dwarves were colliding with the goblins once again. Stinthad and Sideburns were leading the charge. The cannons were leaving, covering fire for the outside, but on the inside, things were once again looking grim for the military. Hacking through the goblins as best they could, moving towards the base of the shotguns, the gates slammed shut. And this time the dwarves had a trick up their sleeves. They'd been chipping away in the ceiling so that they could release a wall of molten rock. Not this time, goblins. It doesn't matter your numbers. Not this time, for you shall melt. And if anybody wants to know what this looks like in ASCII, well, there it is. The goblins fled from the indestructible onslaught of the machines of Gortusk, a fortress truly worthy of the name Mountain Home. As the siege broke, some dwarf spontaneously combusted in my hospital. This happened a few times, and I have no idea what caused it. I just kind of wanted to mention that I saw it happen a couple times, so if anybody knows why that happened, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. There's no fire anywhere near here, and it's not even remotely close to my lava reservoir, but I had a couple dwarves spontaneously combust. It's bizarre. Deep below, they'd finally accessed the godlike metals. Bright metal, they called it. And so they began melting them down into craftable bars. This great discovery would be the greatest success that Gortusk had ever had, and Lorbam, the heretic mechanic, began the honors. But many were still far from at peace. The dwarf Kadol, Edomas, servant of Yugath, known locally by her friends and family as YouTube, had tantrumed in the wrong place and been blessed by a curse from Yugath larval Flems, the lustful. This was a sign from the gods above, a gift for the fortress. And as Kadol continued to run through the floors of Gortusk, the reports began rolling in of her crimes. But it was a sign that it was time to move forward with their plans. And as she warped and became a dark creature in the prisons, the final piece was placed in the king's throne room. And Gortusk became the Mountain Home. The gods surely want us to dig deeper still, but the leadership of Gortusk knew that the gods wanted something else. It was time to purge the heretics, and as the final migrants wandered into the fortress, even Megamind agreed. Kadol was to be a sacrificial beast for the disciples of Yugath, and the heretics' days were numbered. Stinthad, who had raised the rank of Duchess of Gortusk, gave the final orders, and the heathen king moved to his bedroom. And as the moon became full, Kadol turned and was flung into the lava, and the heretics burned. Joyous with their newfound silence and peace, the disciples of Yugath told stories of the once heathens in the fortress. But they had one final task to complete. The king was sleeping, and the sacred starvation, Asmil Hair, Truss Floors, did the honors, and released Guz, drive chanted, the Hardy. Entering the king's chambers, the king managed to sneak behind the creature, and using his godly, bright metal scimitar, he attacked the Hydra. But his attacks would miss. "I must withdraw," the heathen king screamed, jumping out of the way of the creature. But it was too late. He had already lost his left hand. Gripping his blade with the other hand, he danced around the creature. But it was no use. The Hydra clawed the heathen king in the upper body, tearing apart the muscle and the liver. Wielding his appointed weapons, the king would kneel, accepting his fate. And the Hydra bites the heathen king in the head, tearing apart the muscle and bruising the skull. The dwarves would memorialize the king in his tomb, but no message of who was to be appointed king or queen. A few weeks passed, and Stinthad had given herself the role, High Disciple of the Dead Communion. But footsteps were heard at the back gate, and Kivish the newly appointed queen had arrived. The messengers from the fortress had informed the Helixes that the king had died, and Kivish Routtools was the rightful heir. And as honorable as that seems, the dwarves of Gortusk didn't really care, and she wasn't a worshipper of Yugath. There was one thing they must do, and they'd prepared for it. The queen was to be executed, and Tun, Steel Cobalt, did the honors. And as he hacked the queen in the head with his battle axe, and the injured part was cloven asunder, he screamed aloud, "Can it all end so quickly? This does not scare me." And after a discussion with the local rivals at the Helixes and Mountain Halls, Logum Oxtrot, Quake-notched, claimed the position of Queen of the Iron of Power. Oxtrot was a renowned scholar of the fortress, and more than worthy of the throne. The cultists of Gortusk had become victorious, and the royal elephants were finally gifted to their rightful queen to serve as her royal guard, and the other elephant was gifted to Stinthad, High Disciple, and the Elephant Tender. Gortusk would continue on in relative peace. Aside from the onslaughts of goblins, a few ghosts haunted the place, and the sieges were very large and consistent. But it didn't matter their numbers, for no matter what the goblins tried, the dwarves had an answer, and when everything failed, the walls of lava would prevail. Glory to Gortusk, a dwarven fortress of legend, not the happiest tale, or a tale of honor, but a tale of death, deceit, and anger. And no matter the scale of the enemy onslaught, the dwarves had a response. Glory to Gortusk. May every goblin burn. Congratulations, you made it to the end. Since the last one was literally my most commented and liked and responded to video I've ever made, and my second most viewed, I figured I'd answer some questions here. The Neil Black asks, so when's the follow-up expedition with the goal of recovering the legendary shield from the depths of hell? Well, as soon as I finish editing this bloody video and get it uploaded, and then get 8 hours of sleep, and then tomorrow I will start streaming, which will be the day that this video goes up, and then that's when I'm going to start streaming the follow-up of attempting to recover the shield from the blockade in adventure mode. That's going to be done on stream first, recorded, and then once I've completed that, or failed horribly at that, then that'll be edited into the follow-up. Cross Maliki asks, how was he able to embark with a fortress bigger than 6x6? Simple, it's a setting in the options menu. And how did it run so well? Well, it didn't. A lot of cases the game was actually running at roughly 50 frames a second, which for 26 dwarves average of a fortress is actually pretty terrible. Swordquake asks, so you don't have any other recaps of playthroughs? And yes, that is an accurate observation. This was the first one that I did, highlighting the Fortress of Godly Tombs. And now that it's completed, I've done this as a follow-up, and this is the types of major videos I'm doing going forward. I also plan to eventually branch out into other games, but for right now we're sticking with Dwarf Fort. All of my older playthroughs can just be found on the VOD channel, which isn't everybody's cup of tea, but it is what it is. Anthony asks, a pile of what now? Red Mist. You heard me. Urist McFarmer asks, what the bonk did I just watch? A video. Duh. And Rusty Venture, you can find that sound effect in Project Zomboid. I believe it's called Stab. Lancer Munda asks about lag and oceans, and all I can really say to that is, well, it depends on how big your computer is and how good you are at optimizing fortresses. Fortunately, most lag problems are fixable these days, unlike in older versions. And Agent Sapphire asks, I have a legitimate question. If anyone who plays a lot of DF knows the answer, does the horrible undead rain affect vampires? Yes. Yes, it does. And Van Gods asks how this lovely video was missed in their feed, to which I have to say, you clearly found it, so it worked eventually. And Bizarro Plays asks if I'm recording with Fraps, and no, that was just a comedy bit. And Mr. Repcf asks if allied zombies would be immune to the rain, to which I have to say, maybe? I don't know, I obviously didn't do the science here, but if you want to find out, the save files for all of these things are available in the description of the video. That's specifically related to Godly Tombs, but this one, if you would like to play these save files, you can find them in the Google Drive links in the description of the video, and if you would like to support my work directly, you can do that via the mug that I have for sale, or alternatively, following my blog. My blog is the best place to actually support me directly because I get 100% of the revenue. Of course, the base tier is free to get you the weekly newsletter, but if you want to do anything more than that, it's $3 a month starting. Of course, I also stream on Twitch full-time, as well as on YouTube, so if you see me live, feel free to pop by. Probably live if you're watching this the day it goes up. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'm gonna go to bed now. Bum, bum. Bum, bum.